It's September 24th, 1942. Inside a conference room at Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, the air was so tense you could almost feel it pressing down on your shoulders. The room was massive, a cavernous space with high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes that blocked out any glimpse of the autumn sun. An enormous oak table dominated the center, polished to a mirror sheen, surrounded by the top brass of the German Wehrmacht. Their uniforms were immaculate, their boots shining, medals glinting under the dim chandelier light. Yet the expressions on their faces were carefully neutral, an essential mask in the presence of Hitler. Every officer in that room knew that a single misstep, a single word out of line, could end a career, or worse. At the front of the room sat Hitler himself, rigid, eyes burning with intensity. His presence seemed to bend the room to his will, an invisible weight that kept every officer on edge. Standing before him, composed but resolute, was General Franz Halder, the chief of the German General Staff. He was about to deliver what history would remember as his final briefing, a moment that would define both his career and the fate of an army. Since 1938, Halder had been at the helm of the German General Staff. He had orchestrated victories that seemed impossible to most military minds of the time. Poland fell in weeks. France had been crushed in 6. Across the Low Countries, Germany's dominance appeared unstoppable. Halder's strategies were meticulous, his calculations precise, and his ability to translate the complex machinery of war into actionable plans had earned him a formidable reputation. But on this day, the autumn chill of 1942 carried a foreboding sense of finality. Halder knew that what he was about to do could cost him everything. He was going to speak a truth that no one dared voice aloud in Nazi Germany. He was going to be honest. The subject of the briefing was Stalingrad. For 60 grueling days, General Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army had been slowly grinding through the industrial maze of Stalingrad along the Volga River. Every victory was measured in meters rather than miles. Every street, every factory, every building had been contested fiercely. The cost had been staggering. Halder had pored over reports, calculated losses, and reviewed logistics with surgical precision. Since August alone, the 6th Army had lost more than 80,000 men. The fresh tide of Soviet troops crossed the Volga nightly, relentless and unyielding. Meanwhile, German supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers across open, unforgiving steppe, vulnerable to Soviet partisan attacks that grew more brazen with each passing week. And winter, a merciless and inevitable force, was approaching rapidly. The army was not ready. Halder began his briefing with cold, unflinching numbers. Every point was backed by data, every claim meticulously documented. Then he spoke the words that would seal his fate. Mein Führer, our current forces cannot capture Stalingrad. The cost in lives and resources will far exceed any possible advantage. My recommendation is to consolidate our current positions, build defensive preparations for winter, and renew our offensive in the spring. Once we have sufficient supplies and fresh troops. Silence fell immediately. The room, previously filled with the low murmur of officers shifting in their seats, became oppressive. Every man understood the gravity of what had just occurred. Halder had dared to challenge Hitler directly. He had suggested that the Führer's vision might be flawed. In Nazi Germany, such words could end a career, or worse, lead to imprisonment, or death. Hitler's face flushed a deep crimson. His legendary temper was infamous. Yet when he began to speak, his voice was low and restrained, a tone far more dangerous than shouting, for it signaled a storm barely contained. "So you propose withdrawal," Hitler said, his words sharp as a blade. "You, who have been part of every setback and every pause in this campaign. You, who have preached caution while I have delivered victory after victory." Halder stood firm, the years of military discipline etched in every line of his posture. This was his defining moment. He could have stepped back, offered a timid apology, or rephrased his caution in more palatable terms. Instead, he chose the full truth, aware that his career would be over the instant he spoke. "Mein Führer," Halder continued, voice steady, "I have examined the logistics in precise detail. Each day, the Sixth Army requires roughly 700 tons of supplies. On the best days, we manage perhaps 300 tons. Once winter sets in, that number will drop further. The Soviet forces are not collapsing. Intelligence suggests a massive counteroffensive is being prepared, likely aimed at our flanks, where Romanian and Italian divisions are holding positions with insufficient anti-tank capabilities. If we continue to concentrate all efforts on Stalingrad itself, we are setting the Sixth Army up for encirclement." The precision of Halder's analysis only heightened the tension. These were not vague speculations. These were hard, undeniable calculations directly at odds with Hitler's vision of unstoppable victory. He was presenting cold, unarguable facts against a leader who prized ideology, willpower, and blind determination over realism. Hitler rose abruptly from his chair, the contained fury finally breaking through. "You dare lecture me on what can and cannot be done?" Hitler thundered. "I who have achieved what every so-called expert claimed impossible? I who crushed France in 6 weeks, while your precious general staff insisted it would take years? I who elevated Germany from ruins to continental supremacy?" Halder attempted to respond, calm but resolute. "Mein Führer, I am not disputing your past accomplishments. I am merely presenting the mathematical realities of our supply situation." Hitler's voice escalated into a shout, filling the room with raw, unrestrained rage. "Always with you it is mathematics, logistics, and caution. Victory comes from willpower, from determination, from refusing to admit defeat. The Bolsheviks are crumbling. Stalingrad is the pivot. Once it falls, their entire position along the Volga collapses. We will command the river. We will secure the oil fields of the Caucasus. We will win this war! But at what cost?" Halder's voice rose, trembling with controlled urgency. "Even if we succeed in taking Stalingrad, which will take at least another month of brutal, street-by-street combat, the army will be worn out, stranded hundreds of kilometers deep in enemy territory. Winter bearing down, supply lines incapable of sustaining us." Hitler slammed his fists on the oak table, the sound reverberating like cannon fire. "I am surrounded by pessimists and defeatists, men who see obstacles instead of possibilities, generals who retreat at the first hint of difficulty. You, Halder, have been holding this army back from day one. You opposed attacking France, resisted the invasion of the Soviet Union, and now you resist Stalingrad." There was truth in his words. Halder had often voiced concerns over Hitler's ambitious campaigns, though he had also executed them with brilliance. But Hitler remembered only dissent, never past successes. In his worldview, to question him was to be wrong, regardless of facts. The officers around the table shifted uncomfortably. Some silently agreed with Halder, having seen firsthand the logistical nightmares, the exhaustion of the troops, and the thinly held flanks. Yet none dared speak. Experience had taught them the lethal price of disagreement in Hitler's presence. Halder made one final appeal. "Mein Führer, I have given Germany decades of faithful service." Hitler cut him off, voice laced with contempt. "You have served your fears, the obsolete mentality of your general staff, not the vision that Germany demands. I require generals who believe in victory, not bean counters obsessed with costs." Turning to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, his unwavering yes-man, Hitler pronounced, "Halder is removed as Chief of the General Staff, effective immediately. General Kurt Seitzler will replace him, perhaps a younger officer with first-hand Eastern Front experience can bring the aggressive mindset this role demands." Halder unpinned his insignia, laying them carefully on the polished oak table. His fate had been sealed the moment he chose honesty. He executed a precise, formal salute, then walked out, the weight of decades of service collapsing into the resignation of forced retirement. In the coming years, he would be arrested after the July 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, despite no direct involvement. Yet as he left, he held a grim satisfaction. He had been right. Every calculation, every warning had been accurate, and history would prove it. 8 weeks later, on November 19, 1942, Halder's predictions materialized. Soviet forces struck the flanks of Stalingrad, where Romanian troops were thinly spread and ill-equipped. Their positions collapsed within hours. By November 23rd, the Sixth Army was completely encircled. Over 280,000 German soldiers were trapped inside the city Hitler had demanded be taken, regardless of the cost. The Luftwaffe attempted an air supply operation, but the numbers Halder had calculated were impossible to meet. On most days, no more than 100 tons of supplies reached the army, far below the 700 tons needed daily. Troops starved. Fuel and equipment dwindled. Medical supplies vanished. Soldiers froze in inadequate shelters, illness rampant, morale collapsing. Trapped commanders sent desperate messages begging for permission to break out. Hitler refused, confident that sheer determination could overcome the logistical nightmare. Relief operations would supposedly succeed. Yet no amount of willpower could conjure food, ammunition, or warmth. Halder's cold, precise math had proven irrefutable. By December, the army could barely fight. By January, starvation and disease claimed thousands. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered, their dreams of victory reduced to rubble, just as Halder had foreseen. The story of Stalingrad stands as a grim testament to the cost of ignoring reality in favor of ideology, and to the courage of a man who spoke the truth despite knowing it would destroy him. General Franz Halder left that room on September 24, 1942, not as a hero of victory, but as a prophet of disaster, a man vindicated by history even as the empire he had served crumbled around him. From the 280,000 men trapped in Stalingrad, roughly 91,000 survived long enough to surrender. Even then, survival was only the beginning of a new ordeal. Most of those men would perish in Soviet prison camps over the following months and years. Starvation, disease, exhaustion, and harsh winter conditions claimed the vast majority. Only around 6,000 would ever return to Germany, a mere fraction of those who had set out to capture the city in the name of the Reich. Franz Halder, observing all of this from his forced retirement, recorded every development with meticulous care. His diaries, filled with frustration, precision, and bitter reflection, would later become essential historical records, offering a window into both the collapse of the Sixth Army and the structural failures of Hitler's command system. In those pages, Halder catalogued the precise ways in which his predictions had unfolded, day by day. He noted the collapse of the Romanian flanks, the failure of Luftwaffe supply missions, and the relentless attrition of the German troops inside Stalingrad. Beyond the logistics, he reflected on the deeper, systemic problem that had doomed him and, ultimately, the Reich. Hitler had built a command system in which truth was whatever he decreed it to be. Facts that contradicted his vision were dismissed as pessimism or defeatism. Officers who presented accurate, evidence-based evaluations were accused of cowardice or lacking initiative. Professional competence was subordinated to ideological loyalty. The consequences were profound. The Wehrmacht's leadership had been poisoned by a culture where officers no longer reported reality. Instead, they filtered, distorted, or concealed information to protect themselves. Halder had tried to maintain professional standards, attempting honest evaluations and realistic planning. But in Hitler's Germany, truth-telling was dangerous, while sycophancy guaranteed survival. Being wrong but loyal could earn promotion. Being right but critical could earn dismissal disgrace, or worse. His replacement, General Kurt Seitzler, initially embraced the aggressive, optimistic outlook that Hitler demanded. For a time, Seitzler delivered exactly what the Führer wanted: confident predictions of success, assurances of supply, and bold attack plans. But as the months progressed, Seitzler began to recognize the same logistical realities and operational dangers Halder had identified months earlier. By then, the army was trapped. When Seitzler raised concerns, the response was the same as it had been to Halder: dismissal of doubts, accusations of defeatism, insistence that sheer willpower could overcome any obstacle. Seitzler endured longer than Halder, but eventually the strain of navigating Hitler's ego and impossible orders took its toll. By 1944, he suffered a nervous breakdown and was removed from command. This pattern repeated itself across the Wehrmacht. Skilled generals who provided honest assessments faced punishment, while yes-men who echoed Hitler's desires survived and thrived. The result was a military increasingly detached from reality. Even the most talented officers had to devote enormous energy to managing Hitler's temperament rather than focusing solely on the war. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most gifted operational mind, mastered this delicate balancing act. He presented realistic evaluations in ways that softened the bluntness of truth, requesting flexible defensive positions instead of outright retreat, advocating strategic repositioning instead of surrender. His approach sometimes worked, but even Manstein's ingenuity was hampered by the constant need to navigate Hitler's ego. The tragedy of Halder's dismissal went far beyond the loss of a capable officer. It sent an unmistakable signal throughout the Wehrmacht. Honesty was punishable. Deception, or at least selective reporting, was safe. Officers at every level learned to conceal unfavorable information. Intelligence reports were sanitized, casualty figures minimized, enemy strength underestimated, and supply shortages downplayed. By the time reports reached Hitler, they were often shadows of reality, making him base his strategic decisions on fantasy rather than fact. The gap between perception and reality widened relentlessly, contributing to catastrophic errors in 1943, 1944, and 1945. Stalingrad became the ultimate symbol of this dysfunction. Hitler insisted the city could and must be captured for political, strategic, and symbolic reasons. Halder had warned that it could not be taken without unbearable cost. He had been fired for presenting this sober assessment. History would prove him right in the most devastating manner imaginable. Yet even after this disaster, Hitler did not learn. He continued to purge honest advisors, surround himself with yes-men, and trust his gut over professional expertise. The pattern persisted through the later stages of the war. In 1944, when Allied forces landed at Normandy, Hitler refused to release panzer reserves, convinced the landings were a diversion, and that the main assault would occur at Calais. His generals knew better, but having learned the consequences of contradiction, they constrained their guidance. By the time Hitler realized Normandy was the primary front, it was too late to mount an effective counterattack. In 1945, as Soviet forces encircled Berlin, Hitler continued issuing orders to phantom divisions and planning impossible counteroffensives, relying on armies that had been destroyed months before. His staff, recognizing the futility, carried out these orders with grim obedience, having learned that obedience in failure was tolerated. But honesty in counsel was fatal. Halder survived the war, detained briefly by the Americans, and later consulted extensively for historical research on German operations. He provided detailed testimony on the collapse of professional military planning under Hitler's ideological dominance, documenting the mechanisms by which the Führer's refusal to accept reality produced strategic disasters. In his later writings, Halder reflected with complex emotion on his dismissal. Being proven right offered only cold comfort as hundreds of thousands of men died needlessly. Yet he retained his professional integrity. He had spoken truth when it was dangerous and paid the full price for it. The lesson of Halder's firing transcends military history. It illustrates what happens when institutions value loyalty above competence, when dissent is punished, and when leaders surround themselves with subordinates who tell them what they wish to hear rather than what they need to know. In such systems, truth becomes scarce, decisions are made on comforting lies, and catastrophe becomes inevitable. September 24, 1942, was the day Hitler fired his most competent general for being honest about Stalingrad. By silencing Halder, Hitler guaranteed that no one else would dare speak truth, setting the stage for one of the greatest tragedies of the war. The forbidden truth of Stalingrad became a human catastrophe, a stark reminder that in any organization, whether military or otherwise, silencing truth-tellers carries consequences far beyond the personal. Franz Halder lived until 1972, witnessing a rebuilt Germany, historical acknowledgement of his foresight, and partial restoration of the Wehrmacht's reputation. He understood that being right mattered little if no one believed you, and that speaking truth could cost everything, while deception and delusion could cost nations. The firing of Halder was not merely a personnel change. It was a deliberate choice between reality and fantasy, competence and ideology, truth and comforting lies. Hitler chose wrongly. 280,000 men at Stalingrad paid the ultimate price.